Forget Apple. Forget Nvidia. And forget the oil fields of Saudi Aramco. If you combined the market value of every single tech giant today, you would still fall short of a company born 400 years ago. $7.9 trillion. That was the value of the Dutch East India Company. They invented the stock market, launched the world's first IPO, and changed the world forever. But this story doesn't begin with money. It begins with a gunshot, a leader assassinated in his own home, a German refugee family fleeing execution, fathers terrified they wouldn't see their children grow up. As he lay dying, his final words were, "Lord, have pity on this poor people." Enter Maurice of Nassau, William the Silent's son. He was only 17 when he took command after his father's murder, but he possessed a cold, analytical genius. While the merchants studied ledgers, Maurice studied ancient history, obsessed with Roman military texts. He realized that the Spanish could not be beaten by bravery alone. They had to be beaten by science. But a revolution built on science, professional armies, mobile artillery, and endless sieges cost a fortune. The feudal model of funding war was dead. Without money on a scale the world had never seen, the House of Orange would be wiped off the map. This is the Golden Age synergy. The merchants in Amsterdam provided the unlimited capital through the stock market, the stock, and the House of Orange used that money to build the world's most disciplined army, the gun. Without the Orange family's military shield, the Dutch East India Company would have been crushed by Spain. Without the Dutch East India Company's money, the Orange Army would have gone bankrupt. One hand washed the other. And together, they scrubbed the Spanish Empire off the map. Picture a corporation so powerful, it possessed the sovereign right to declare war on independent nations, mint its own currency, and even execute foreign leaders, all while its shares were traded publicly on a booming stock exchange. Operating between 1602 and 1799, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, amassed profits, true, net profits, not merely revenues equivalent to an astounding $7.9 trillion in contemporary dollars. Yet, the foundational truth is often unstated. They were not just merchants, they were the world's inaugural multinational corporation, meticulously engineered from its very inception to deploy systematic violence. They proved that a private corporation, willing to deploy unlimited violence in the relentless pursuit of unlimited profits, could establish imperial control far more efficiently than traditional governments. But they didn't just invent shares, they invented the dark arts of trading. The Dutch traders were the first to gamble on the future. They created futures contracts and short-selling betting that a company would fail. They developed transfer pricing to dodge taxes and manipulated supply to engineer artificial scarcity. Before Wall Street had computers, the Dutch had already mastered every trick in the book to separate the world from its money. Yet, the foundational truth about the VOC often goes unstated. They were far more than simple merchants who opportunistically gained political clout. They stood as the world's inaugural multinational corporation, meticulously engineered from its very inception to deploy systematic violence. Picture a corporation so powerful, it possessed the sovereign right to declare war on independent nations, mint its own currency, and even execute foreign leaders, all while its shares were traded publicly on a booming stock exchange. Operating between 1602 and 1799, the Dutch East India Company amassed profits, true, net profits, not merely revenues amassing wealth that eclipsed the treasury of any European kingdom. But they didn't just count coins, they counted conquests. This monolithic enterprise held sway over an empire geographically larger than the entire continent of Europe, maintained military might surpassing that of most national standing armies, and exerted a diplomatic influence so profound that European monarchs were compelled to negotiate with its directors as equals. Yet, The foundational truth about the VOC often goes unstated. They were far more than simple merchants who opportunistically gained political clout. They stood as the world's inaugural multinational corporation, meticulously engineered from its very inception to deploy systematic violence, calculated economic warfare, and overwhelming technological superiority in the construction of a corporate dominion stretching across 3 continents. The raw statistics of its operation are breathtaking. Over its 2-century lifespan, the VOC commissioned approximately 4,800 ships, a number exceeding the combined naval fleets of Spain, Portugal, and England. At its peak, it employed 2.5 million people across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Its private armies successfully subjugated the coveted Spice Islands, cemented control over the strategic Cape of Good Hope, and established commercial outposts ranging geographically from Japan to Persia. Crucially, the VOC innovated and perfected key business practices that remain fundamental to contemporary corporations. Shareholder capitalism, a model explicitly designed to maximize returns for investors, often at the expense of human welfare. Comprehensive vertical integration, ensuring control over every phase of production and global distribution. And sophisticated market manipulation, used to create artificial scarcity and thus maximize commodity prices. The Dutch did not merely participate in the lucrative spice trade, they systemically weaponized it. When indigenous rulers declined to grant the company exclusive trading rights, VOC armies swiftly launched invasions. When rival European merchants dared to challenge their dominance in Asian ports, VOC fleets responded by sinking their vessels. And when local Asian producers attempted to sell their goods directly to independent buyers, VOC officials summarily executed them for breaching the company's imposed monopoly agreements. Company shareholders hailed these brutal policies as brilliant commercial strategy. VOC stock delivered average annual returns of 18% for almost 200 years, a level of performance that would cause modern hedge fund managers to ache with envy. The dividend payouts distributed to Dutch investors frequently eclipsed the total governmental budgets of many sovereign European nations. But this staggering corporate success was cemented through systematic exploitation, costing millions of lives, annihilating entire civilizations, and setting chilling precedents for corporate conduct that still define global capitalism. The VOC engineered an entity unlike anything seen before in human history. A purely profit-driven organization, endowed with the sovereign authority to declare war, levy taxes, and administer populations across vast international territories. They conclusively demonstrated that a private corporation, willing to deploy unlimited violence in the relentless pursuit of unlimited profits, could establish imperial control far more efficiently than traditional monarchical governments. This is the history of how 7 Dutch merchants inadvertently crafted the blueprint for modern corporate power. It is the history of the world's first truly global empire, an empire erected not by kings or generals, but by shareholders and accountants who realized that systematic brutality translated directly into extraordinary returns on investment. This is the story of the VOC, the company that perfected the devastating art of transforming mass human suffering into guaranteed shareholder profits. The VOC did not merely participate in the lucrative spice trade, they systemically weaponized it. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Banda Islands in 1621. Driven by the desire for an absolute monopoly over the global nutmeg supply, Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen concluded that partial control was inadequate. His proposal was chillingly explicit: complete elimination of the indigenous Bandanese population. The Banda genocide commenced in May 1621. VOC forces systematically murdered Bandanese men, enslaved women and children, and destroyed virtually all evidence of the pre-Dutch Bandanese civilization. They replaced the population with enslaved laborers to maintain artificial scarcity. The result? Nutmeg, produced at a cost of merely 1 guilder on the Dutch-controlled plantations, was sold for an astounding 300 guilders in European markets. In Amsterdam, shareholders hailed these brutal policies as brilliant commercial strategy. VOC stock delivered average annual returns of 18% for almost 200 years, and to protect themselves, they innovated a key business practice: limited liability. This structure shielded individual investors' personal assets from the legal repercussions of corporate misconduct. It meant you could profit from genocide, but never be held responsible for it. This was the true genius of their invention. It wasn't just about protecting money. It was about protecting consciences. The stock market created a psychological buffer. A shareholder in Amsterdam could sip coffee and celebrate a 25% dividend, completely detached from the massacre that generated it 7,000 miles away. They were investors, not soldiers. They received profits, not responsibility. It allowed good people to fund unspeakable evil, without ever losing sleep. But while the money kept flowing, the foundation was rotting. Monsters have a weakness. They are hungry. By the late 1700s, the VOC wasn't dying from war. It was dying from corruption. Officials were lining their own pockets. The debt became unpayable. On the 31st of December 1799, the world's biggest company officially went bankrupt. The monster was dead. And suddenly, the House of Orange lost their ATM. Without the company's money, they needed a new source of power. But this family knows how to pivot. In 1815, after Napoleon was defeated, they returned. But they didn't come back as servants of the Republic anymore. They rebranded. They declared themselves kings. But the men who wore this new crown were a disaster. First, there was William II. Publicly, he was a hero. But behind the palace walls, he was living a double life. He was addicted to high-stakes gambling. He amassed massive secret debts through card games that nearly bankrupted the royal treasury. But he was a saint compared to his son, William III, a man the international press nicknamed King Gorilla for his crude behavior and violent temper. His marriage to Queen Sophie was a nightmare. Sophie, an intellectual woman, was trapped with a man she called an uneducated farmer. In her private letters, she wrote the haunting words, "I am queen in name, but a prisoner in heart." The scandals were endless. Mistresses influencing court decisions, public rows, and a monarchy that seemed destined to self-destruct. The dynasty was on the brink of extinction. The male line was dying out. But then, the script flipped. The throne passed to a series of strong women. They cleaned up the mess. They transformed the gorilla image into a respectable, modern monarchy. First, Queen Wilhelmina became the voice of resistance against Hitler in World War II, broadcasting from exile. Then, her daughter Juliana rebranded the monarchy completely. They became the bicycle monarchy. Pictures of the royals cycling to work, sending their kids to public schools. It was a masterclass in PR. We are just like you. But were they? Not entirely. While the queens repaired the public image, the family's financial roots remained deep underground. The empire of land was gone, but the empire of capital evolved. They have mastered the art of the double wallet. While the state pays for the palaces and the staff, their private billions grow quietly in the dark, shielded from public scrutiny. We are talking about strategic stakes in Philips Electronics, the aviation giant Royal Dutch Airlines, and most significantly, Royal Dutch Shell. It wasn't just an investment. Shell was born from the amalgamation of Dutch oil interests operating within the exact same territories the VOC once conquered. Different commodity, same playbook. Today, the royal family remains deeply tied to Dutch industry, discreetly holding stakes in these titans. Their true wealth is not in the bank accounts, It is in the hidden network, shielded by complex financial architecture. But here is the final, brutal irony. You can own the oil, the banks, and the history books. But there is one thing that even 400 years of wealth cannot buy: freedom. Meet Princess Amalia, the heir to the throne. Born in 2003, she inherited a legacy worth billions. But recently, she hasn't been living like a future queen. She's been living like a fugitive. In 2022 and 2023, intelligence agencies uncovered credible threats from organized crime, plots to kidnap or attack her. She was forced to abandon her student life. She had to flee the country, secretly living in Madrid for a year, unable to walk the streets of the kingdom she is destined to rule. Does this sound familiar? It should, because the story has come full circle. In 1584, this dynasty began with a man, William the Silent, trapped in his home, waiting for an assassin's bullet. Today, 4 centuries later, his great-granddaughter is trapped in her palaces, hiding from the world. They built a global empire to escape danger, only to find themselves back in the crosshairs. And what of the blood that paid for this gold? On July 1st, 2023, King Willem Alexander finally did the unthinkable. He stood before the world and apologized for the royal family's role in slavery, acknowledging that his ancestors did nothing to stop it, acknowledging the horror. Think this is ancient history? Look around. The VOC was the prototype. When Amazon pays 0 taxes while crushing local businesses, that's the VOC model. When Facebook operates with virtually no oversight, that's the VOC model. They proved that a corporation, if big enough, can become sovereign. It can write its own laws and become more powerful than the government that birthed it. But the enduring lesson of the House of Orange-Nassau is not about monarchy. It's about strategy. They taught us that when an old source of power is dying, the one who first masters the new source of power will rule. They privatized war, financialized trade, and decentralized their own sovereignty into global investment vehicles. They proved that a private corporation, willing to deploy unlimited violence in the relentless pursuit of unlimited profits, could establish imperial control far more efficiently than traditional governments. Power doesn't disappear. It just shifts from the sword to the stock. And the cost of that transition is a debt history is still collecting. The genesis of the Dutch East India Company stemmed from a straightforward realization: mastery over the spice trade guaranteed command of the global economy. Yet, unlike other European nations that merely dispatched opportunistic expeditions seeking rapid gains, the Dutch conceived of a revolutionary innovation, a permanent corporate institution. This entity was designed specifically to seize total monopolistic control over all Asian commerce through coordinated military and economic aggression. Consider Amsterdam in 1595. The bustling city was alive with maritime enterprise, as merchants tallied the immense profits from recent Indonesian voyages. A single successful journey to the Spice Islands often yielded 400% returns on investment. For example, nutmeg, bought for 3 Dutch guilders in the Banda Islands, could fetch 300 guilders in affluent European markets. Black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves promised similarly astronomical profit margins. However, these extraordinary financial incentives generated a critical, unforeseen problem: overwhelming self-competition among the Dutch traders themselves. Numerous independent Dutch companies simultaneously launched Asian expeditions, a trend that inflated local purchase prices in Asia while simultaneously saturating European markets with spices, thus depressing final sale prices. Indigenous Indonesian rulers skillfully exploited this division, pitting the Dutch rivals against each other to extract higher prices and better access terms for spice-producing lands. Compounding this domestic chaos, Portuguese and English merchants were aggressively expanding their operations in Asia, directly jeopardizing Dutch commercial superiority. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the chief minister of Holland Province, recognized that this chaotic, zero-sum competition was actively dismantling Dutch commercial opportunities. His analysis, delivered to the States General in 1600, articulated the fundamental weakness. Individual Dutch merchants lack the necessary capital to establish permanent Asian settlements, provide adequate military protection, or enforce coordinated commercial policies. We are permitting foreign competitors to capitalize on our organizational disunity despite our superior maritime technology. The prescribed remedy was a landmark moment in economic history. Consolidate all competing Dutch companies into a single, unified corporate entity, granting it the requisite capital, overwhelming military force, and political authorization to secure permanent, monopolistic control over Asian spice production and distribution. The company charter, formally approved on the 20th of March 1602, brought into existence an entity previously unimagined, a private corporation, vested with sovereign governmental powers. The VOC was explicitly permitted to establish and govern colonies, maintain professional standing armies and navies, initiate and wage wars, negotiate binding treaties, mint its own currency, and impose taxation on subjugated populations. No European state had ever bestowed such comprehensive, quasi-national authority upon a commercial enterprise. Furthermore, the Charter institutionalized the joint stock corporate model, dividing ownership into shares that investors could freely trade without disrupting the company's core operations. This mechanism enabled the VOC to amass vast pools of capital from hundreds of investors, while preserving centralized management and strategic cohesion. The initial capitalization reached 6.4 million guilders, approximately $100 million today. This staggering sum surpassed the capital reserves controlled by most European governments, dwarfed the funding raised by any prior commercial venture, and exceeded the combined capital that the competing Portuguese and English East India companies would manage for decades. Mere capital, however, was not sufficient to overcome entrenched Portuguese and English competitors, who already commanded strategic Asian ports and cultivated relationships with indigenous rulers. The VOC required a systematic advantage, a structure that would both eclipse existing European merchants and repel any future challengers. Their strategic blueprint was devastatingly effective and brilliantly ruthless. Instead of simply engaging in the existing Asian trade model, where European buyers negotiated with local producers who sold to multiple bidders, the VOC resolved to establish exclusive, comprehensive control over the spice production process itself. This involved negotiating treaties to secure monopoly rights over entire harvests, constructing imposing fortifications to block rival access to spice-growing regions, and, most critically, employing overwhelming military force to crush any resistance to the Dutch commercial monopoly. Peter Both, appointed as the company's first Governor-General, received explicit instructions that stripped away any pretense of pure trade. They mandated, "You will establish permanent Dutch control over spice production throughout the Indonesian archipelago, by whatever means prove necessary. Rival European merchants shall be excluded entirely from Dutch-controlled domains. Indigenous rulers who demonstrate cooperation will be afforded protection and financial compensation. Rulers who offer resistance will face severe military consequences until such time as cooperation is achieved." The whatever means prove necessary clause authorized systematic violence previously deemed unacceptable by European trading ventures. The VOC's actions included setting fire to rival merchants' facilities, executing indigenous leaders who dared violate monopoly contracts, and actively destroying entire spice plantations if producers attempted to sell to non-Dutch buyers. The company's sophisticated organizational structure mirrored this imperial ambition. It maintained distinct administrative departments dedicated to military operations, diplomatic relations, territorial governance, and commercial activities. Its officials were trained in disciplines, warfare, international negotiation, and administration comparable to the education provided for governmental diplomatic corps. Crucially, the VOC established permanent institutional infrastructure in Asia, fundamentally unlike the temporary trading expeditions that merely returned to Europe upon completing a single voyage. They constructed enduring administrative centers, substantial military garrisons, shipyards, and massive warehouses, all designed to sustain perpetual corporate control across the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. The headquarters in Batavia, modern Jakarta, established in 1619, swiftly became the governing capital of this corporate empire, ruling millions of people across territory stretching from Japan to the Cape of Good Hope. It was not a mere trading post. It was the seat of a sovereign, corporate state. VOC operations diverged critically from traditional European colonization in several key respects. While traditional colonies were administered by royal officials serving the crown and reporting to monarchs, VOC territories were managed by company employees, answerable only to corporate directors and the interests of the shareholders in Amsterdam. Traditional colonization extracted wealth primarily to fill royal treasuries and boost national power. VOC territories were plundered solely to generate investor dividend payments and inflate stock prices for private individuals. Most tellingly, traditional colonial powers typically acknowledged some nominal governmental obligation to protect subject populations and maintain basic social order. The VOC, conversely, prioritized ruthless profit maximization without regard for human consequence, viewing local inhabitants strictly as economic resources rather than governmental responsibilities. This corporate model of colonization demonstrated shocking efficiency. The VOC consistently generated enormous profits, even as many traditional government colonies frequently incurred massive financial losses. VOC territorial expansion was guided by cold, strategic, commercial calculation, whereas traditional colonial growth was often driven by royal ambition that outstripped available resources. By 1620, the VOC commanded spice production across the entire Indonesian archipelago, operated trading centers spanning from India to Japan, and registered annual profits that surpassed the total revenues of nearly every European nation. They had achieved the truly unprecedented, absolute corporate dominance over intercontinental trade, yielding astronomical wealth for private shareholders, while simultaneously consolidating political authority over vast foreign lands. But this was merely the prelude. The VOC had proven that private enterprises could establish empires more efficiently than traditional states, provided they were dedicated to employing unlimited violence in their pursuit of unlimited profits. They were about to reveal that corporate colonialism could be far more extractive and brutal than the imperialism pursued by any European monarch. The world's first multinational corporation was poised to prove that systematic corporate brutality could produce shareholder returns that made royal treasuries look pitiful in comparison. The age of corporate empire had dawned. In a discreet chamber within the Amsterdam City Hall, 7 Dutch merchants affixed their signatures to the documents that would irrevocably reorganize global trade. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the United East India Company, was officially born the world's first multinational corporation endowed with the sovereign rights to wage war, found colonies, and govern foreign peoples. This was not a routine trading venture. The VOC represented an unparalleled structure, a purely profit-driven organization designed to operate as an independent nation-state, dedicated solely to serving its private shareholders rather than monarchical or national interests. The 6 rival Dutch companies responsible for the VOC's formation had been effectively cannibalizing their own profits through vicious, chaotic competition in the rich Asian markets. The Amsterdam, Zeeland, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen companies had all confirmed that Indonesian spices yielded extraordinary returns but only if competition could be eliminated both internally among themselves and externally from foreign rivals. Dirk van Os, representing the powerful Amsterdam company, had compiled crucial intelligence detailing the competitive vulnerabilities plaguing Dutch merchants. Our individual expeditions generate 300 to 400% profits when successful, but Portuguese competitors already command the most valuable ports. English merchants are aggressively expanding their reach, and local rulers are demanding increasingly prohibitive terms because they can easily play one Dutch company against another. The imperative solution demanded a revolutionary coordination of Dutch commercial interests. Instead of continuing their mutually destructive rivalry, they would fuse their capital, accumulated expertise, and political leverage to forge one monolithic organization capable of establishing absolute, monopolistic control over all Asian spice production. The intense negotiation process showcased the sophisticated financial engineering that would prove vital to the VOC's success. Each component company contributed its assets, ships, capital reserves, commercial expertise, and political connections in exchange for a proportional stake in the new combined organization. The final ownership framework apportioned shares based on the value of contributed assets while deliberately preventing any single regional faction from overwhelmingly dominating corporate governance. Merchants from Amsterdam secured 57% of VOC shares, reflecting their superior financial backing and maritime capabilities. Zeeland merchants controlled 20%. Delft and Rotterdam held 14%, and Hoorn and Enkhuizen retained 9%. This calculated distribution guaranteed Amsterdam's strategic leadership while ensuring broad regional participation, which was essential for securing stable political backing across the Dutch Republic. Critically, the Charter codified revolutionary principles of corporate governance that would shape global business structures for centuries. Shareholders were granted the ability to freely trade their stakes without requiring approval from co-owners. Operational management was entrusted to professional administrators, who reported directly to elected directors, rather than to individual investors. Most monumental was the provision for limited liability protection. Shareholders' personal fortunes could not be seized to cover corporate debts or compensate for damages inflicted by the company's actions. This limited liability was indispensable for attracting investment into an enterprise that openly intended to utilize systematic violence to achieve commercial goals. Wealthy Dutch families could thus profit immensely from VOC operations, without fear of risking their personal estates should the corporation's military campaigns incur catastrophic legal liabilities or trigger diplomatic retribution. The initial stock subscriptions immediately confirmed the extraordinary faith Dutch investors placed in this novel corporate structure. The VOC successfully raised 6,424,588 guilders, approximately $110 million in modern value, during its offering. This capital pool eclipsed the funding attempted by any previous commercial venture, exceeded the liquid wealth controlled by most European governments, and was more than adequate to finance concurrent, massive operations across all of Asia. Yet, capital reserves alone could not guarantee victory against entrenched competitors. The Portuguese, who had commanded Asian trade routes for over a century, the English, who were rapidly expanding their financial footprint, and, critically, the local Asian traders, whose deep knowledge of regional markets vastly surpassed that of any European. The strategic master plan devised by the VOC directors was breathtaking in its scope and detail. They would construct permanent administrative centers at all strategic Asian hubs, moving away from temporary trading visits. They would compel local rulers to sign exclusive treaties, explicitly prohibiting them from trading with any rival merchant. They would erect formidable fortifications, capable both of defending Dutch facilities and preventing competitors from building nearby. Most decisively, they would maintain a formidable military capacity, authorized to deploy direct violence when necessary to eradicate any challenge to the Dutch commercial monopoly. The 17 directors governing VOC operations received continuous, detailed intelligence regarding Portuguese and English commercial movements throughout Asia. These intelligence reports pinpointed critical vulnerabilities that Dutch military and financial superiority could exploit. The Portuguese model relied heavily on a few fortified ports connected by dangerously exposed shipping lanes. Although Portuguese merchants fostered relationships with some indigenous rulers, they lacked the military capacity necessary to unilaterally enforce their commercial mandates when local interests diverged from Lisbon's objectives. English operations, meanwhile, were restricted in both scope and capital. The English East India Company possessed roughly 1/10 the capital commanded by the VOC, maintained minimal military assets, and primarily focused on the less lucrative Indian markets rather than the prized Indonesian spice trade. From the Dutch perspective, the most promising weakness was that neither competitor had secured systematic control over the actual production of spices. They purchased goods from local growers, who remained free to negotiate with multiple buyers, thereby providing the Dutch with the opportunity to outbid or coerce producers into redirecting entire spice supplies toward VOC-controlled distribution networks. The VOC's immediate strategic priority was the permanent subjugation of the Spice Islands, specifically the Banda and Maluku Islands, the only places where nutmeg, mace, and cloves grew naturally. Control over these islands meant the power to dictate global prices for the world's most prized agricultural commodities. Peter Botha, appointed the first Governor-General, received explicit authorization to secure this control using whatever methods proved necessary. His preserved instructions confirm the company's intent to utilize unlimited violence for profit. You are authorized to negotiate exclusive trading agreements with local rulers, employing financial incentives, political leverage, or military force as the situation demands. Rulers who cooperate will receive protection and economic benefits. Rulers who offer resistance will face severe consequences until cooperation is achieved. Botha's expedition was outfitted with resources unprecedented for a commercial endeavor. 12 dedicated warships carrying 1,000 professional soldiers, along with massive supplies of construction materials for fortifications, administrative equipment for colonial governance, and negotiating gifts valued at over 200,000 guilders. This was demonstrably not a trading mission. It was a corporate invasion, engineered to establish permanent Dutch hegemony over Asian lands and convert them into profit-generating assets for private shareholders. The fleet's departure from Amsterdam in December 1603 signaled a profound shift in the nexus of commerce and state power. Where previous European expeditions served royal authority and national interests, the VOC operated under corporate authority, serving only shareholder interests. Where previous missions tried to integrate profitably into existing Asian trade structures, the VOC sought to shatter those structures and impose new ones, serving their exclusive monopoly. And where previous missions viewed local Asian populations as potential partners, the VOC viewed them as obstacles to corporate control populations to be eliminated, subordinated, or violently integrated into Dutch production systems. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange reacted by driving up VOC share prices as investors anticipated unparalleled profits from an organization fusing the latest European military technology with the most systematic commercial planning ever conceived. However, the VOC was soon to discover that securing corporate control over Asia would demand a level of organized violence that far surpassed anything previous European merchants had dared to attempt. Local rulers would not willingly forfeit their sovereignty for Dutch dividends, and Asian producers would not passively accept corporate subjugation. The world's first multinational corporation was preparing to learn that empire building required corporate armies willing to wage total corporate warfare against entire populations who rejected commercial domination disguised as cooperation. The very first major military operation undertaken by the VOC, instantly revealed the brutal calculus of the corporate empire. When local populations refused to serve shareholder interests, systematic violence was swiftly adopted as standard business practice. In February 1609, Governor-General Pieter Both anchored his formidable fleet off Banda Nera, the administrative heart of the Banda Islands. These islands were the sole global source of nutmeg and mace, inhabited by approximately 15,000 indigenous people who had successfully preserved their independence for centuries. The Bandanese population had every rational motive to reject the Dutch demands. For generations, they had thrived by selling their nutmeg to a wide range of buyers: Portuguese, English, Chinese, and Javanese merchants, all of whom competed by offering favorable terms and respecting local sovereignty. The VOC's proposals, in contrast, were designed to annihilate this competition and impose a total Dutch monopoly over all Bandanese economic life. Chief Oronkaya greeted the Dutch delegation with customary hospitality, yet he delivered a firm rejection of their commercial terms. The nutmeg trees belong to our ancestors and to our children. We will continue to sell our spices to any buyer who offers fair prices and honest treatment. No foreign merchants shall dictate what we produce on our own land. Both's reply immediately confirmed the VOC's readiness to deploy military force against populations resisting corporate rule. The Dutch Republic has invested substantial resources to establish commercial operations across the Indonesian archipelago. Rulers who align with Dutch commercial objectives will receive our protection and financial benefits. Rulers who dare to oppose these objectives will face military consequences until the requisite cooperation is achieved. What Both referred to as military consequences was, in reality, systematic terrorism engineered to coerce Bandanese submission through sheer psychological fear rather than conventional conquest. VOC forces made no immediate effort to occupy the territory. Their goal was to demonstrate their capability to utterly dismantle Bandanese society. When indigenous leaders refused compliance, the resulting 6-month siege of Banda Nera established the terror tactics the VOC would replicate throughout its empire. Dutch warships imposed a punishing blockade, halting both food imports and spice exports. Landing parties systematically torched nutmeg groves and destroyed food crops to induce artificial famine. Dutch soldiers captured local Bandanese leaders and executed them publicly, broadcasting the fatal cost of opposing Dutch commercial interests. Most disturbingly, Dutch forces intentionally brutalized civilian populations, women, children, and the elderly, to maximize psychological pressure, aiming to convince Bandanese leaders that ongoing resistance would culminate in total societal collapse. Dr. François Caron, serving as a VOC medical officer, documented the calculated nature of the Dutch terror campaign in his confidential dispatches. Our military operations prioritize civilian terror above achieving traditional battlefield success. Although the Bandanese military remains capable of organized resistance, their political leaders cannot sustain popular support when resistance results in systematic civilian casualties. The psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective. Bandanese leaders were forced into an impossible decision: continue defying Dutch demands and watch their people suffer and perish, or surrender their ancient independence to shield the population from further Dutch violence. In August 1609, the surviving Bandanese leaders signed the Treaty of Banda, which awarded the VOC exclusive rights to purchase all nutmeg and mace produced in the islands at prices dictated solely by Dutch officials. Bandanese producers were forbidden from selling to non-Dutch buyers, were denied the right to negotiate alternative terms, and faced execution for breaching the monopoly agreement. The treaty instantly converted independent Bandanese producers into enslaved suppliers for a Dutch corporate monopoly, while simultaneously providing the legal pretext for perpetual Dutch military occupation of their territory. Yet, the VOC soon learned that signing a treaty did not terminate local resistance. It merely changed its manifestation. Bandanese producers resorted to smuggling spices to non-Dutch buyers, who offered better prices. Bandanese leaders sought military aid from Portuguese and English merchants, who shared an interest in shattering the Dutch monopoly. Even individual families attempted to conceal spice yields to evade Dutch taxation and regulation. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, appointed Governor-General in 1618, concluded that partial control over spice production was inadequate for maximizing corporate profits. Absolute control, he argued, demanded the complete elimination of the indigenous Bandanese population, replacing them with enslaved laborers who had no choice but to serve Dutch commercial interests. His proposal to the Heren the Seven Lords, 17, was chillingly explicit in its genocidal intent. Bandanese resistance persists despite our treaty obligations and military demonstrations. Complete profit maximization necessitates systematic population replacement that will eradicate all future resistance while guaranteeing absolute corporate control over nutmeg production. The director's formal response, preserved in the company archives, unequivocally demonstrated how corporate profit calculation could justify unlimited brutality. Governor-General Cohen is authorized to implement whatever population control measures prove necessary for securing permanent Dutch commercial advantages in the Banda Islands. Long-term profit maximization mandates permanent solutions to local resistance problems. What the directors euphemistically labeled population control measures was, in practice, systematic genocide designed to forge the optimal environment for corporate profit extraction. The Banda genocide commenced in May 1621 and persisted for 3 months until the indigenous population was functionally eliminated. VOC forces systematically murdered Bandanese men, enslaved women and children, and destroyed virtually all evidence of the pre-Dutch Bandanese civilization. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century later confirmed the horror, uncovering mass graves containing thousands of skeletal remains from this period. Cohen's the confidential communications reveal the cold, calculated methodology of corporate genocide. The complete annihilation of Bandanese resistance was achieved through the systematic removal and replacement of the indigenous population. As a direct result, the Banda Islands immediately began generating maximum profits with minimal security concerns. This successful model suggested that similar, ruthless operations should be deployed whenever local inhabitants obstructed the corporation's commercial ambitions. The new workforce, imported to manage the spice plantations, comprised enslaved laborers brought from Java, Chinese indentured workers, and Dutch colonial settlers who received land grants conditioned on strict adherence to corporate production specifications. Lacking any historical ties to the Banda Islands or alternative economic avenues, this new population was wholly unable to resist Dutch corporate authority. The subsequent economic outcomes surpassed even the most optimistic corporate forecasts. Under the VOC's direct supervision, nutmeg production soared by 340% within 5 years. This exponential growth was fueled by the forced labor of enslaved people, who were compelled to work longer hours, cultivate larger areas, and accept subsistence-level living conditions that the free Bandanese producers would never have tolerated. Crucially, the elimination of the local population simultaneously eradicated any internal resistance to the corporation's ruthless price manipulation strategies. The VOC now had the power to restrict nutmeg exports to European markets, deliberately manufacturing an artificial scarcity that drove prices to unprecedented heights. Nutmeg, produced at a cost of merely 1 guilder on the Dutch-controlled plantations, was sold for an astounding 300 guilders in European cities. Corporate shareholders hailed these returns as a brilliant business strategy, demonstrating the decisive superiority of systematic planning over unpredictable, chaotic competition. Between 1621 and 1625, VOC stock prices climbed by 190% as investors recognized that corporate-sanctioned genocide could generate extraordinary returns on investment. The success in Banda convinced the VOC leadership that these same methods could be systematically deployed across the entire Indonesian archipelago, guaranteeing total corporate dominance over spice production. Local rulers throughout the Maluku Islands, Sulawesi, Celebes, and Java would soon face an ultimatum: either willingly surrender their independence to serve Dutch commercial interests, or face systematic eradication, followed by replacement with more compliant workers. Chief Merchant Isaac Lamiere summarized the chilling lesson in his confidential report to Amsterdam shareholders. Our Banda operations demonstrate that systematic violence can achieve commercial objectives more efficiently than traditional negotiation or limited military pressure. Local populations that cannot be profitably incorporated into corporate production systems should be eliminated to prevent future resistance problems. The VOC had thus unearthed a devastating truth that would fundamentally shape corporate behavior for centuries to come. When the pursuit of maximum profit clashed with basic human survival, corporate interests could readily justify unlimited violence against civilian populations interfering with shareholder returns. Yet, the Banda genocide was merely the chilling prelude. The VOC was quickly learning that controlling spice production was only the initial phase in constructing a corporate empire capable of generating profits through the systematic exploitation of entire continents. The world's most profitable corporation was prepared to demonstrate how private corporate armies could achieve imperial conquest more efficiently than conventional royal forces, how corporate administrators could extract wealth more systematically than traditional colonial governors, and how corporate shareholders could openly celebrate mass murder as a successful business strategy. The Spice Wars had established the horrific precedent. Human lives were acceptable casualties for the maximization of corporate profit. By 1625, the VOC had fundamentally transformed itself from a mere trading company into a formidable military organization, embracing armed force as its primary business strategy. Corporate executives swiftly realized that owning powerful warships offered far greater returns than the tedious process of negotiating with foreign competitors. The scale of the company's military expansion was breathtaking. The VOC naval forces ballooned from just 12 ships in 1603 to 150 warships by 1630, a fleet larger than the navies of most European nations. These were not simply converted merchant vessels fitted with defensive guns. They were purpose-built warships, engineered for aggressive military campaigns against rival merchants, defiant local rulers, and any other impediment to the Dutch commercial monopoly. This fleet included 40 heavily armed ships of the line, capable of devastating coastal defenses, 60 frigates optimized for rapid strike operations against commercial shipping, and 50 smaller vessels tailored for deployment in the shallow Asian waters where Portuguese and English rivals maintained their trading posts. Crucially, VOC warships operated under purely corporate rather than national authority. Ship commanders took their direct orders from company executives in Batavia, not from government officials in Amsterdam. Military victories generated immediate corporate profits, serving shareholder interests above any national strategic objectives or royal glory. Admiral Cornelius Mataliev, commander of the VOC fleet, clearly articulated that corporate naval power served distinct goals compared to traditional royal navies. Our fleet exists to eliminate commercial competition through military superiority. We attack merchant shipping, destroy competitors' facilities, and blockade ports that refuse to accept Dutch commercial terms. Traditional naval warfare between royal fleets is irrelevant to our corporate objectives. The strategic doctrine was cold and meticulously systematic. VOC forces would first identify lucrative trade routes utilized by competitors. They would then demand exclusive trading rights from local authorities while simultaneously positioning warships to impose a tight port blockade. If these demands were rejected, if local rulers refused to grant the desired monopoly privileges, VOC forces would deploy selective violence to demonstrate their overwhelming military capability until compliance was achieved. If competing European merchants attempted to maintain operations within Dutch-claimed areas, the VOC forces would aggressively attack their facilities, seize their ships, and imprison their personnel until the competitors entirely abandoned their Asian operations. The 1622 attack on Portuguese Macau vividly demonstrated how corporate military power could systematically eliminate established competitors. Portuguese merchants had controlled Macau for over 7 decades, cultivating cordial relations with Chinese officials and profiting substantially from the lucrative China-Europe trade. VOC commanders identified Macau as a critical threat to Dutch commercial expansion because Portuguese control over key Chinese trade routes severely limited Dutch opportunities in those markets. The corporate solution was a direct military assault designed to utterly eliminate the Portuguese presence in Chinese waters. Admiral Piet Hein led 22 volts OC warships against Macau's Portuguese defenders, who possessed only 8 lightly armed vessels and minimal coastal fortifications. The battle lasted just 6 hours, culminating in a complete Portuguese rout. VOC forces seized Portuguese facilities, confiscated all assets, and expelled the merchants from all Chinese trading operations. However, the VOC forces did not attempt to permanently occupy Macau. Instead, they leveraged their military victory to demand that Chinese authorities grant exclusive trading privileges to Dutch merchants, while explicitly prohibiting all future Portuguese commercial activities in Chinese waters. Having just witnessed the VOC's ruthless military might, Chinese officials agreed to the Dutch demands rather than risk similar military aggression against their own cities. The Macau victory simultaneously achieved multiple corporate objectives. It eliminated Portuguese competition from Chinese markets. It demonstrated VOC military supremacy to Chinese authorities. And, most importantly, it established the precedent that corporate military force could coerce foreign governments into granting commercial privileges that served Dutch shareholder interests. Corporate shareholders celebrated the victory as brilliant strategic planning that increased company assets while drastically decreasing future competition. VOC stock prices surged by 45% following the news of the Portuguese defeat, as investors grasped that systematic military aggression generated superior returns compared to traditional commercial negotiations. The English East India Company soon faced similarly brutal corporate military pressure when they attempted to establish rival operations in Indonesian waters. English merchants had operated a modest, profitable trading post at Bantam, Java, since 1602, maintaining peaceful relations with local Javanese rulers. VOC executives deemed the English presence at Bantam unacceptable competition, arguing that it reduced Dutch profit margins and provided encouragement to other potential challengers to the Dutch monopoly. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, serving as Governor-General, immediately ordered direct military action against the English facilities. English commercial activities at Bantam violate our exclusive trading agreements with Javanese authorities. English merchants will be expelled from all Indonesian territories to prevent future interference with Dutch commercial operations. The attack on Bantam in December 1623 showcased the systematic depravity of VOC corporate violence. Dutch forces did not merely capture the English post. They implemented a campaign of systematic terror explicitly designed to deter any future English attempts to establish competing operations in Indonesian markets. VOC soldiers seized 20 English merchants and publicly tortured them before executing them for daring to infringe upon Dutch commercial privileges. They completely razed the English facilities to ensure they could never be restored. Furthermore, they imposed collective punishment on the Javanese officials who had permitted the English presence, executing local leaders who had cooperated with the rival merchants. Crucially, they circulated detailed accounts of the English suffering throughout the Indonesian archipelago to ensure that other local rulers fully grasped the horrifying consequences of permitting non-Dutch commercial activities within their domains. The resulting psychological impact was precisely what the VOC leadership desired. Local rulers across Indonesia voluntarily expelled competing European merchants rather than risk similar Dutch military retaliation. English, Portuguese, and Spanish trading operations rapidly collapsed throughout the archipelago as local authorities refused to provide any protection against the omnipresent threat of Dutch corporate violence. Gabriel Taliesin, the English chief merchant at Bantam, wrote in his final letter before his execution, "The Dutch have transformed commercial competition into systematic warfare, where no quarter is given and no mercy is shown. They seek not just commercial advantage, but complete elimination of all competing interests through unlimited violence." The English East India Company reacted to this overwhelming force by completely withdrawing from Indonesian markets, instead concentrating their operations in India, where they hoped to avoid direct confrontation with superior Dutch military capabilities. This strategic retreat left the VOC with absolute monopoly control over the world's most valuable spice-producing territories. By 1630, VOC, corporate military forces, had achieved something entirely unprecedented: the systematic elimination of European commercial competition throughout the Indonesian archipelago, through highly coordinated military operations that served exclusively private shareholder interests. This unparalleled military success created new operational challenges, requiring further institutional development. VOC territories now encompassed millions of inhabitants who needed to be governed according to corporate rather than traditional political objectives. Local populations had to be reorganized to serve Dutch commercial interests while preventing any resistance that could threaten the extraction of corporate profit. The solution lay in developing corporate governmental institutions capable of administering conquered territories far more efficiently than the traditional colonial administrations operated by European monarchs. These VOC territories would be managed by company employees who reported directly to corporate executives, bypassing royal officials who served national interests. This unique brand of corporate colonialism would prove more extractive and brutal than anything European kings had previously attempted, precisely because corporate administrators served only the mandate of shareholder profit maximization, with zero obligation to protect colonized populations. The armed trading phase had successfully accomplished its strategic objectives. The VOC now controlled the territory, populations, and resources necessary to generate extraordinary profits for Dutch shareholders, while preventing any meaningful challenge from foreign merchants or resistant local rulers. Yet, controlling territory was only the beginning. The company now needed systematic methods for extracting maximum wealth from conquered populations, while maintaining military control over vast foreign lands, using only limited Dutch personnel and resources. The VOC was about to discover that building a corporate empire was easier than operating it profitably long-term, while preventing local resistance from destroying corporate infrastructure and eliminating personnel. By 1640, the VOC commanded an empire stretching 15,000 miles, from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to the islands of Japan, a territory larger than Europe, governed entirely by corporate executives serving private shareholder interests rather than royal authority. Batavia, the administrative hub, had become the capital of a vast commercial empire, overseeing over 3 million people across hundreds of islands, port cities, and trading posts. This was fundamentally different from traditional European colonialism, where royal governors were at least nominally expected to serve national interests while maintaining some semblance of obligation toward colonized populations. This was corporate colonialism, where company officials upheld shareholder profit maximization as their sole administrative objective. Governor-General Antonio van Diemen received explicit instructions from the Heeren XVII, the Lords 17, that illuminated the fundamental divergence between corporate and royal colonialism. All administrative decisions will prioritize long-term profit maximization for company shareholders. Local populations will be organized to serve corporate commercial objectives. Resources will be extracted to generate maximum returns on invested capital. Local customs, traditional authorities, and indigenous institutions will be maintained only when they directly serve corporate interests. The corporate empire was organized according to strict, rational business principles rather than traditional governmental structures. The Indonesian archipelago was partitioned into administrative regions based on economic productivity rather than cultural or political boundaries. Each region was assigned specific production quotas for commodities, like spices, rice, timber, and minerals that reflected the corporate assessment of local economic potential. Regional administrators received annual performance evaluations based on their success in maximizing economic extraction, while simultaneously minimizing administrative expenses. Administrators who exceeded their production quotas received bonuses and promotions. Those whose regions failed to meet corporate expectations faced immediate dismissal or reassignment to less profitable territories. The Maluku Islands, which were under direct VOC administrative control, serve as a stark example of how corporate colonialism prioritized profit extraction above human welfare. The indigenous population had been largely exterminated during the conquest, replaced by enslaved workers imported from Java, Chinese indentured laborers, and Dutch settlers who managed the spice plantations according to rigorous corporate specifications. This replacement population endured conditions that could never have been imposed on free indigenous inhabitants. Enslaved workers labored 14 hours daily during harvest seasons, subsisting on rations, meticulously calculated to maintain minimal work capacity while drastically minimizing food costs. They resided in company-provided housing designed for maximum occupancy rather than basic human comfort. Company medical officers monitored worker health not out of humanitarian concern, but purely to optimize labor productivity. Dr. Johannes van den Bosch reported to Batavia administrators, reducing worker food rations below current levels would decrease productivity more than it would reduce costs. Current rationing represents optimal balance between maintaining work capacity and minimizing feeding expenses. The corporate approach to worker management reflected a systematic calculation designed to extract maximum labor value while minimizing human resource costs. Workers who became too sick or injured to maintain productivity were simply replaced rather than treated. Workers who attempted to escape plantation labor faced swift execution, displayed as a grim deterrent against resistance among the remaining populace. Spice production under corporate control rapidly surpassed all previous levels, because enslaved workers could be forced to work longer hours, tend larger plantations, and accept living conditions that free producers would never have tolerated. Clove production in the Maluku Islands surged by 280% between 1630 and 1650, while production costs simultaneously plummeted by 60% due to the systematic exploitation of unpaid labor. This economic efficiency was extraordinary by contemporary standards. Corporate administrators had achieved something traditional royal colonies had never managed: profitable extraction that consistently generated returns, exceeding administrative costs, while maintaining absolute control over vast indigenous populations. The most innovative feature of VOC corporate colonialism was the systematic integration of conquered territories into a unified commercial empire, designed to maximize profits through coordinated economic planning rather than fragmented, territorial exploitation. Java provided essential rice and manual labor for the spice plantations in the Maluku Islands. Ceylon supplied cinnamon and precious stones for European export. India provided textiles and manufactured goods for trade throughout the Indonesian archipelago. and the Cape Colony served as a critical supply point for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. Each territory was assigned specific economic functions within the larger corporate empire, based on local resource availability and production capabilities. This vertical integration allowed the VOC to control every stage of production and distribution, minimizing costs through internal coordination rather than reliance on external market purchases. This complex administrative integration required unprecedented coordination among corporate officials scattered across 3 continents. Monthly reports from regional administrators provided meticulous information regarding local economic conditions, production capabilities, security situations, and opportunities for expanding corporate operations. Annual conferences convened senior administrators from across the empire to coordinate economic planning, share administrative innovations, and develop new strategies for managing local populations more efficiently. These corporate conferences functioned as intensive business meetings focused solely on profit maximization, distinct from governmental councils concerned with administrative justice or population welfare. The corporate empire's legal system reflected these same priorities. VOC territories operated under company law explicitly designed to serve corporate interests, rejecting traditional colonial law that often attempted to balance European and indigenous legal traditions. Company officials served as judges in legal proceedings that prioritized protecting corporate property and maintaining labor discipline over resolving disputes between individuals. Legal penalties directly reflected corporate cost-benefit calculations rather than traditional concepts of proportional punishment. Theft of company property resulted in execution because tolerating minor theft was believed to encourage additional losses that could severely damage corporate profitability. Resistance to work assignments resulted in physical punishment severe enough to discourage similar actions among other workers. Local populations rapidly learned that their survival depended entirely on serving corporate interests, rather than maintaining traditional social relationships or cultural practices. Traditional leaders retained ceremonial authority only if they actively helped enforce corporate labor requirements and production quotas. Traditional religious practices were permitted only when they did not interfere with work schedules or challenge corporate authority. The psychological impact was devastating but economically efficient. Local populations redirected their energy toward meeting corporate expectations rather than sustaining traditional social institutions that could have provided a foundation for organized resistance against corporate control. Chinese merchant communities across the VOC empire quickly adapted to corporate colonialism by acting as crucial intermediaries between Dutch administrators and the local populations. Chinese merchants managed local commerce according to VOC regulations, while providing essential cultural translation services that helped Dutch officials understand local conditions and manage indigenous groups more effectively. This collaboration was highly beneficial for both the Chinese merchants and the Dutch administrators, yet it was devastating for the indigenous populations who found themselves governed by foreign authorities communicating through foreign intermediaries who shared no cultural connection to local traditions or population welfare. By 1660, the VOC Empire had achieved a degree of systematic integration that allowed for coordinated economic planning across vast distances, while maintaining absolute control over millions of people through minimal Dutch personnel. The entire empire was administered by fewer than 3,000 Dutch officials, who supervised millions of workers, soldiers, and local administrators serving corporate objectives. The administrative efficiency was unparalleled in the history of European colonialism. Previous colonial empires required costly military occupation, vast governmental bureaucracies, and substantial financial subsidies from European royal treasuries. In contrast, the VOC Empire generated consistent profits while covering its own administrative costs and military expenses. Corporate shareholders enjoyed extraordinary returns on their investments, while the Dutch government avoided the financial burdens associated with traditional colonial administration. The VOC had conclusively demonstrated that corporate colonialism could be far more profitable and efficient than royal colonialism, provided corporate administrators were willing to prioritize profit maximization over human welfare. However, the corporate empire was about to face challenges that would test whether business efficiency could sustain long-term control over populations, who increasingly realized that corporate colonialism offered them nothing except permanent exploitation disguised as economic development. Local resistance was beginning to emerge among populations who had no vested interest in corporate success and every reason to support corporate failure. The island empire had achieved maximum efficiency and profit extraction. Now it would discover whether efficient extraction could be sustained indefinitely against populations who had no stake in corporate success and every reason to support corporate failure. Between 1650 and 1700, the VOC achieved an unprecedented feat in economic history: near-complete monopoly control over the global trade in the world's most valuable commodities, all while operating as a private corporation, accountable only to its shareholders, free from meaningful governmental oversight. The figures illustrate the extraordinary scope of corporate market manipulation. The VOC controlled 90% of global spice production, 70% of Asian textile exports to Europe, 60% of the global coffee trade, and 40% of worldwide sugar distribution. No governmental body, royal dynasty, or religious institution had ever commanded such a large percentage of international commerce. Crucially, the VOC had mastered maximizing profits through systematic market manipulation rather than simply controlling production. They could engineer artificial scarcity by restricting exports, dictate prices by timing market entries, and eliminate competition through strategic dumping, flooding the market to destroy competitors' financial viability. The spice markets vividly demonstrated how corporate monopoly control enabled outrageous price manipulation. Nutmeg that cost a single guilder to produce in VOC plantations was sold for 310 guilders in Amsterdam markets when the company restricted exports to maintain artificial scarcity. When Portuguese or English merchants attempted to compete by sourcing alternative spice supplies, the VOC would instantly flood European markets with low-priced spices until their competitors faced bankruptcy, only to then immediately resume their scarcity policies, driving prices back to monopoly levels. Joan Maetsuika, serving as Governor-General from 1653 to 1678, perfected these market manipulation strategies. Our competitive advantage derives not from superior production efficiency, but from our ability to control market supply according to profit optimization calculations. We can destroy competing merchants by temporarily sacrificing profits, then recover these losses through monopoly pricing once competition has been eliminated. The psychological impact on European markets was exactly as the VOC intended. Merchants attempting to compete with Dutch spice imports understood they faced an organization possessing sufficient financial resources to sustain massive temporary losses until all competition was eliminated. Few were willing to risk bankruptcy by challenging Dutch market control. European governments began treating the VOC as a sovereign power rather than a mere private corporation, because the company's economic influence now exceeded that of most European kingdoms. French Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert wrote in his confidential report to King Louis XIV, "The Dutch company controls European access to Asian commodities more completely than any European monarch controls domestic commerce. Their economic power requires diplomatic recognition, comparable to that accorded to sovereign nations." This diplomatic recognition soon became explicit when European governments began negotiating formal treaties directly with VOC representatives, bypassing the need for Dutch government intermediation for commercial agreements. The Treaty of Breda, 1667, included specific provisions recognizing VOC territorial control over the Indonesian islands. The Treaty of Westminster, 1674, formally acknowledged VOC authority to regulate English commercial activities in Asian waters. These treaty recognitions established legal precedents that would influence international law for centuries. Private corporations could achieve sovereign status through economic power, territorial control, and military capability, regardless of formal governmental structures. However, the VOC's global monopoly required constant, often brutal, enforcement against local populations who attempted to circumvent corporate control through smuggling, alternative production, or resistance to corporate labor requirements. The company quickly learned that maintaining monopoly control was far more costly and complex than achieving initial market dominance. The Clove Wars in the Maluku Islands stand as a grim example of the systematic violence needed to maintain the corporate monopoly against tenacious local resistance. Indigenous populations had traditionally cultivated clove trees throughout the island chain, selling their harvests to various buyers who competed for access to local production. VOC monopoly policies mandated the elimination of all clove production outside of company-controlled plantations. Corporate officials ordered the systematic destruction of clove trees growing in uncontrolled areas. Company soldiers traveled throughout the Maluku Islands, mercilessly cutting down thousands of clove trees to prevent local populations from maintaining independent spice production that might compete with the corporate plantations. Local populations vehemently resisted these destructive orders because clove trees constituted their primary source of income and held significant cultural value as ancestral property passed down through generations. These resistance efforts inevitably led to persistent military conflicts, necessitating a permanent VOC military occupation of the spice-producing territories. Commander Arnold Delemming van Oordhoorn formally reported on the calculated, systematic nature of these tree destruction operations. We have systematically destroyed approximately 65,000 clove trees across 17 islands to eliminate unauthorized spice production. Local resistance continues despite our military demonstrations, requiring ongoing operations to maintain corporate monopoly control. The campaigns to destroy these trees achieved their immediate economic objectives, but simultaneously created enduring security problems throughout the VOC empire. Local populations correctly perceived that the corporate monopoly policies threatened their traditional livelihoods and fundamental cultural practices, generating the motivation for organized resistance that demanded expensive, long-term military responses. The implementation of the coffee monopoly in Java serves as a vivid example of how corporate control could fundamentally transform entire societies to serve shareholder interests while simultaneously devastating resilient local agricultural systems. Javanese farmers had historically cultivated rice for local sustenance, supplementing their income by growing coffee as a minor cash crop. FOC administrators shattered this balance by imposing stringent coffee cultivation quotas, requiring Javanese farmers to dedicate systematically increasing percentages of their arable land to corporate coffee production for export, rather than essential rice cultivation for local consumption. As European market demand for coffee exports grew, these quotas systematically intensified. By 1680, many Javanese farming communities were forced to dedicate 60% of their land to VOC coffee production, requiring them to import rice from distant regions to satisfy local food security needs. This dramatic agricultural shift drastically increased corporate profits but engineered a perilous food dependency, making local populations acutely vulnerable to famine whenever rice imports were disrupted. The systematic effects were devastating for the local communities, but represented maximal economic efficiency from the corporate viewpoint. Javanese coffee production surged 400% between 1660 and 1700, while production costs remained minimal because farmers were compelled to provide both labor and land without compensation beyond bare subsistence survival rations. Regional Administrator Cornelius Spielmann documented the cold, calculated logic of this agricultural transformation. Javanese coffee quotas have been increased to optimal levels, where further increases would create population unrest that would damage long-term production capabilities. Current quota levels generate maximum corporate profits while maintaining social stability sufficient for continued economic extraction. The global monopoly required highly sophisticated financial coordination to manage commercial operations spanning 3 continents, while ensuring unified corporate policies always served Amsterdam shareholder interests first. The VOC pioneered financial institutions that clearly prefigured modern multinational corporation management systems. Regional treasuries maintained separate accounts for diverse commercial activities and provided detailed quarterly financial reports to the Batavia headquarters. Comprehensive annual consolidated reports delivered deep financial analysis, allowing corporate directors in Amsterdam to precisely evaluate performance across all global operations. Currency management demanded coordination across dozens of different monetary systems, as the company operated in markets utilizing Chinese silver, Indian gold, European copper, and various local currencies. VOC financial officers devised complex exchange rate systems that facilitated commerce across these diverse monetary zones, while enabling profitable currency arbitrage. Most importantly, the company developed robust credit systems that allowed commercial activities to be coordinated across immense distances and long time periods. VOC letters of credit gained acceptance among merchants throughout both Asia and Europe, because the company's financial reputation often exceeded that of most governmental treasuries of the era. These financial innovations enabled commercial operations on scales that would have been utterly impossible using traditional trading methods. The company achieved the ability to coordinate simultaneous, massive operations in Japan, India, Indonesia, Ceylon, and South Africa, all while maintaining unified financial control and strategic planning, directed from a single center. By 1690, the VOC had achieved a level of global economic integration that permitted systematic profit extraction from multiple continents, simultaneously providing Amsterdam shareholders with investment returns that reliably exceeded 25% annually for over 30 consecutive years. Corporate executives had successfully discovered that monopoly control over essential commodities could generate wealth surpassing the treasuries of European kingdoms, all while operating with a legal protection and political autonomy traditional royal enterprises could never achieve. But this formidable global monopoly was about to encounter fundamental challenges that would test whether pure corporate economic power could maintain long-term control over populations who increasingly realized that the VOC empire offered them nothing but permanent exploitation thinly, disguised as commercial development. The monopoly had reached maximum economic efficiency. Now, it would discover whether this efficiency could sustain indefinite political control over millions of people who had learned that corporate success required their permanent, violent subordination. The VOC's systematic brutality was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of commerce. Instead, it was a deliberate, calculating corporate policy designed to maximize shareholder profits through the systematic use of terror, torture, and mass murder against any population interfering with business objectives. Corporate archives unearthed in the 20th century reveal the cold, calculated nature of VOC violence. Company officials didn't just tolerate brutality, they developed sophisticated policies for deploying systematic terror as a specialized business tool to achieve commercial objectives more efficiently than traditional negotiation or economic incentives ever could. The torture chambers in Batavia Castle served as the administrative center for coordinating systematic violence across the vast VOC empire. Company officials meticulously maintained detailed records of interrogation techniques, execution methods, and psychological warfare tactics proven most effective for extracting intelligence, crushing resistance, and terrorizing local populations into rigid compliance with corporate policies. Dr. Andreas Kleyer, serving as company physician in Batavia, documented interrogation procedures in his medical reports. Company interrogation methods have been systematically developed to maximize information extraction while minimizing time requirements. Physical torture techniques produce reliable results within 2 to 3 hours. Psychological pressure methods require 1 to 2 weeks, but generate more comprehensive intelligence about resistance networks. The systematic nature of corporate violence becomes strikingly clear in regional administrators' reports, which treated brutality as a standard administrative tool comparable to taxation, labor management, or infrastructure development. Violence was not exceptional. It was routine corporate policy, implemented according to standardized procedures developed through decades of grim experimentation. The Ambon massacre of 1623 demonstrates how corporate executives could order systematic mass murder to serve immediate business objectives, while maintaining detailed documentation that framed genocide as a rational commercial strategy. English merchants had established a small trading post on Ambon Island, where they competed with VOC operations by offering local producers better prices for spice exports. From the VOC's commercial perspective, this competition reduced profit margins and provided encouragement to other potential competitors who might challenge the Dutch monopoly. Governor-General Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen ordered the swift elimination of the English competition through systematic terror designed to deter any future challenges to VOC commercial rights. English commercial activities on Ambon Island constitute unacceptable interference with company monopoly rights. All English personnel will be eliminated to demonstrate consequences of violating Dutch commercial privileges. The massacre was executed according to detailed corporate procedures designed both to maximize psychological impact and to provide a false legal justification for the company's actions. VOC officials arrested the English merchants on trumped-up charges of conspiring against Dutch commercial interests, staged formal legal proceedings that provided the appearance of a legitimate judicial process, and then executed the English personnel, using torture methods specifically designed to terrorize local witnesses. Gabriel Tersensen and 9 other English merchants were subjected to systematic torture before public execution, to ensure that local witnesses fully grasped the consequences of cooperating with competitors of Dutch corporate interests. The torture methods included waterboarding, limb crushing, and systematic burning, all designed to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness. Local Ambonese officials who had permitted English commercial activities faced similar traitament, serving as examples to other regional leaders who might consider allowing competing merchants to operate in their territories. The collective punishment extended even to the Ambonese civilian populations, who had merely traded with the English merchants. Commander Martinez documented the deliberate nature of civilian targeting. Our operations included systematic punishment of local populations who supported English commercial activities. Collective punishment serves important strategic objectives by ensuring that local populations understand their survival depends on exclusive cooperation with Dutch corporate interests. The psychological warfare extended throughout the Indonesian archipelago, as VOC officials widely circulated detailed accounts of the English suffering, ensuring that other European merchants understood the severe consequences of attempting to establish competing operations in Dutch-controlled territories. The economic results dramatically exceeded corporate expectations. English operations across the Indonesian archipelago collapsed entirely, as local rulers refused to provide protection against Dutch retaliation. Portuguese and Spanish merchants similarly withdrew from Indonesian markets rather than risk comparable corporate violence. Corporate shareholders celebrated the massacre as brilliant strategic planning that eliminated competition, while powerfully demonstrating corporate resolve to protect shareholder interests through unlimited violence. VOC stock prices soared 35% following news of the English elimination, as investors recognized that systematic terrorism could generate superior returns compared to traditional commercial competition. The slave labor system within VOC territories clearly illustrates how corporate brutality could be systematically organized to serve profit maximization through the complete dehumanization of colonized populations. The company operated extensive slave plantations throughout Ceylon, Java, and the Moluccas, where enslaved workers lived under conditions deliberately engineered to maximize labor extraction while minimizing survival rates. Enslaved workers were regarded as disposable economic resources, whose deaths could simply be compensated for by purchasing additional slaves, rather than through investments in improving working conditions. Plantation administrator Willem van Horn documented the calculated management approach to slavery. Optimal plantation profitability requires balancing slave purchase costs against productivity extraction. Current mortality rates of 40% annually represent acceptable levels given available slave replacement costs. Reducing mortality would require increased feeding and housing expenses that would exceed productivity benefits. Enslaved workers on spice plantations routinely worked 16 hours daily during harvest seasons, while receiving food rations meticulously calculated only to maintain immediate work capacity rather than human health. Company medical officers monitored slave populations solely to optimize productivity rather than provide health care, often recommending increased work requirements for slaves who appeared capable of additional labor output. The breeding programs established for enslaved populations treated human reproduction as a form of livestock management, designed to produce workers with specific physical characteristics suited for particular forms of plantation labor. Company officials maintained detailed records of slave genealogies to track inherited characteristics that enhanced productivity in different agricultural activities. Children born to enslaved parents automatically became company property from birth, assigned to work duties appropriate to their physical development. Education was strictly limited to the job training necessary for plantation labor. Medical care was confined to only those interventions necessary for maintaining work capacity. The psychological control systems were elaborately designed to prevent organized resistance through the systematic destruction of cultural identity, family relationships, and social institutions that might provide a foundation for collective action against corporate authority. Enslaved populations were deliberately mixed, including people from diverse cultural backgrounds who could not communicate effectively with each other. Family relationships were systematically disrupted through forced relocations that separated spouses, parents, and children. Traditional cultural practices were prohibited when they created any opportunity for social coordination that might threaten corporate control. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women provided both immediate gratification for Dutch colonial personnel and strategic long-term economic benefits for corporate operations. Children born from these sexual relationships became company property, while simultaneously creating emotional bonds that could be exploited to control enslaved mothers who might otherwise resist corporate authority. Company officials recognized that sexual violence served multiple corporate objectives, providing psychological rewards for Dutch personnel, producing additional enslaved workers, and creating emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maintain control over enslaved populations. Dr. François Valentine, serving as company chaplain, documented the systematic nature of this sexual exploitation. Company policies regarding enslaved women serve important administrative functions by providing recreational benefits for Dutch personnel, while producing additional workers for corporate operations. These policies require careful management to prevent conflicts among Dutch personnel while maximizing productivity benefits. The systematic nature of corporate brutality extended to indigenous populations who maintained nominal independence while being required to serve VOC commercial interests. Traditional rulers who cooperated with corporate demands received protection and limited autonomy. Traditional rulers who resisted corporate authority faced systematic elimination, followed by replacement with more cooperative puppet leadership. This puppet ruler system allowed the VOC to maintain control over large populations using minimal Dutch personnel, while providing the appearance of respecting local political traditions. Puppet rulers implemented corporate policies while accepting responsibility for local resistance that might require violent suppression. Local populations learned that their survival depended entirely on serving corporate interests, regardless of traditional political authority, cultural practices, or personal preferences. Corporate brutality had achieved its core strategic objective: the complete subordination of colonized populations, who understood that resistance would result in the systematic destruction of everything they valued. The brutality was not random violence. It was systematic terrorism, designed to optimize corporate profit extraction through psychological control that made continuous traditional military occupation unnecessary. The VOC had discovered that systematic brutality could achieve imperial control more efficiently than traditional colonial administration, provided corporate executives were willing to use unlimited violence against civilian populations. The VOC did not merely dominate global trade, it fundamentally invented the financial instruments and corporate structures that created modern capitalism itself. Every fundamental aspect of contemporary business, from stock markets to multinational corporations, originated from innovations developed specifically to maximize profits from systematic colonial exploitation. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602 specifically for VOC share trading, became the world's first modern financial market, where ordinary citizens could buy ownership stakes in corporate enterprises. This was not just convenient access to investment opportunities. It was a revolutionary transformation of economic relationships that permitted systematic wealth extraction to serve private investors rather than royal treasuries. Previous European trading expeditions had been financed by wealthy merchants or royal governments who directly controlled operations and collected all profits. The VOC's joint stock structure meant that hundreds of investors could finance massive corporate operations while delegating operational control to professional managers who served shareholder interests collectively. This crucial separation between ownership and management created unprecedented opportunities for systematic profit maximization, because corporate executives could focus exclusively on generating returns for investors without considering governmental obligations, diplomatic consequences, or moral limitations that constrained royal colonial administrators. Isaac Lemaire, one of the original VOC shareholders, immediately grasped the revolutionary nature of this financial innovation. Our corporate structure allows systematic profit extraction without royal interference or moral constraints. Company executives serve shareholder wealth maximization as their sole obligation, enabling commercial strategies that traditional royal administrators could never implement. The initial public offering raised 6.4 million guilders from 1,143 individual shareholders, establishing the first modern example of broad public participation in a colonial enterprise. Ordinary Dutch citizens could purchase shares starting at 3,000 guilders, roughly equivalent to $35,000 today, allowing middle-class families to participate in colonial profit extraction while maintaining a psychological distance from the actual colonial violence. This psychological impact was crucial for sustaining popular support for corporate brutality. Dutch shareholders could celebrate extraordinary dividend payments while remaining psychologically removed from the systematic violence that generated their investment returns. They were investors, not colonial administrators. They received profits, not responsibility for corporate crimes. VOC shares traded continuously on the Amsterdam Exchange, creating the world's first truly liquid market for corporate securities. Share prices fluctuated based on news from Asia, dividend announcements, and speculation about future corporate prospects. Daily trading volumes frequently exceeded 1,000 shares, generating substantial commission revenues for the exchange operations. More importantly, share tradability meant that investors could profit from corporate violence without maintaining a long-term commitment to the colonial enterprise. Shareholders could swiftly purchase VOC stock when military victories promised increased profits, then sell their stakes if corporate brutality created political complications that threatened future returns. The dividend payments reveal the extraordinary profitability achieved through systematic colonial exploitation. Between 1602 and 1650, VOC shareholders received average annual dividend payments of 18% of their invested capital. During peak years, dividend payments exceeded 25% annually returns that would make modern hedge fund managers weep with envy. These dividend payments were distributed in multiple forms to optimize tax efficiency and maintain investor enthusiasm. Cash dividends provided immediate returns. Stock dividends increased shareholders' ownership stakes in corporate assets. Special distributions even included actual commodities, spices, textiles, precious metals that shareholders could sell independently or retain as personal luxury goods. The accounting innovations developed to manage VOC operations established financial practices that continue to influence modern business. The company maintained separate accounts for different geographical regions, different commodity types, and different operational activities. Quarterly financial reports provided detailed analyses of corporate performance across all global operations. Depreciation accounting allowed the systematic recovery of capital investments in ships, buildings, and equipment over multi-year periods. Reserve accounting permitted the allocation of profits to fund future military operations, territorial expansion, and unexpected operational expenses. Cost accounting provided detailed analysis of production expenses, enabling the optimization of plantation operations and trading activities. Most importantly, the VOC developed transfer pricing systems that allowed profit optimization through internal transactions between different corporate divisions. Spices produced in company plantations could be sold to company trading divisions at prices engineered to minimize taxation while maximizing reported profits in jurisdictions with favorable tax treatment. These transfer pricing manipulations prefigured modern multinational corporation tax avoidance strategies, providing legal mechanisms for extracting wealth from colonized territories without paying corresponding taxes to local governments or providing compensation to local populations. The credit systems developed to finance VOC operations created international financial networks that enabled commercial coordination across vast distances and long time periods. VOC letters of credit were accepted by merchants throughout Europe and Asia because the company's financial reputation exceeded that of most governmental treasuries. The credit networks enabled sophisticated commercial strategies that would have been impossible using traditional trading methods. The company could purchase Asian commodities using credit secured by anticipated European sales revenues. They could coordinate currency exchanges across multiple monetary systems while minimizing foreign exchange risks through complex hedging strategies. The insurance markets developed to protect VOC investments established risk management principles that continue to influence modern financial services. Lloyd's of London created specialized insurance policies for VOC shipping that protected against maritime losses while deliberately excluding coverage for damages caused by corporate military activities. These insurance exclusions were crucial for maintaining the appearance of commercial legitimacy while providing legal protection for systematic corporate violence. Insurance covered losses from storms, pirates, or accidents, but explicitly not losses from corporate military operations against resistant local populations or competing European merchants. The banking relationships established to manage VOC finances created the international financial connections that enabled wealth transfer from colonial territories directly to European financial centers. The Bank of Amsterdam, Wisselbank van Amsterdam, and various private banking houses provided currency exchange, international credit, and investment management services that effectively converted colonial exploitation into European financial assets. These banking relationships were crucial for transforming systematic violence into respectable wealth that could be inherited by future generations without any obvious connection to colonial brutality. Colonial profits could be invested in government bonds, real estate, or other European assets that provided steady returns while expertly concealing their origins in systematic exploitation. The corporate legal innovations established precedents for limited liability that protected investors from personal responsibility for corporate crimes. Shareholders could profit immensely from systematic brutality while maintaining legal protection against personal liability for damages caused by corporate operations. This limited liability principle was crucial for attracting investment in enterprises that used systematic violence to achieve commercial objectives. Wealthy Dutch families could invest in colonial exploitation without risking their personal assets if corporate military activities resulted in expensive legal consequences or diplomatic retaliation. The VOC's financial innovations also established precedents for corporate political influence that enabled systematic manipulation of governmental policy to serve private shareholder interests. Company executives maintained extensive political connections that heavily influenced Dutch governmental policies regarding international trade, military support for corporate operations, and diplomatic recognition of corporate territorial control. This corporate political influence created a systematic bias in governmental policy that consistently prioritized private shareholder interests over national strategic objectives or moral obligations. Dutch governmental resources were systematically allocated to support corporate profit maximization rather than serve broader Dutch social interests. By 1650, the VOC's financial innovations had created a comprehensive system for converting systematic colonial violence into respectable European wealth, all while providing the legal protection and political support that enabled continued corporate brutality without meaningful accountability. The financial innovations were not just clever accounting techniques. They were systematic methods for expertly disguising corporate crimes as legitimate business activities, ensuring that profits from systematic exploitation would benefit European investors rather than the colonized populations who suffered to generate those profits. Modern capitalism inherited these fundamental financial structures, along with their profound moral blindness to the human consequences of systematic profit maximization. The VOC had created financial institutions that could celebrate extraordinary returns on investment, while remaining psychologically and legally isolated from the immense violence required to generate those returns. The template was established. Financial innovation could make any level of systematic brutality appear legitimate if corporate executives were skilled enough at manipulating legal structures and accounting procedures. The VOC's ultimate downfall began with a fundamental contradiction inherent in its design. A private corporation could successfully seize imperial control through systematic violence, but maintaining that control required governmental resources that exceeded any corporation's financial capacity over the long term. By 1740, the company was governing over 4 million people across territory spanning 3 continents, while facing increasingly sophisticated resistance that required military responses far beyond corporate capabilities. Local populations had learned that VOC control offered them nothing except permanent exploitation, generating the motivation for organized resistance that began to threaten corporate infrastructure throughout the empire. The Javanese War of Succession, 1741–1743, dramatically demonstrated how local resistance could exploit VOC vulnerabilities. Traditional Javanese rulers had initially cooperated with Dutch corporate control because collaboration offered protection against regional competitors while maintaining nominal political authority. But 4 decades of corporate exploitation had taught Javanese leaders that VOC policies systematically destroyed traditional political institutions while extracting wealth that could have supported local development. Cooperation with corporate authority, offered no realistic pathway to improved conditions for Javanese populations, or genuine autonomy for Javanese leadership. Prince Mas Said led Javanese resistance forces that understood precisely how to exploit corporate weaknesses. Rather than confronting Dutch military superiority directly, Javanese resistance employed highly effective guerrilla tactics that disrupted corporate economic operations while successfully avoiding decisive battles that would favor European military technology. Javanese forces targeted critical corporate infrastructure rather than Dutch military positions. They destroyed spice plantations, burned company warehouses, and captured VOC supply lines that connected administrative centers with outlying production facilities. These attacks severely damaged corporate profitability without requiring Javanese forces to defeat powerful Dutch armies in direct combat. Most importantly, Javanese resistance received overwhelming popular support because local populations understood that a corporate defeat would eliminate the systematic exploitation that made their lives miserable. Javanese civilians provided intelligence, supplies, and personnel for resistance operations, while expertly maintaining the appearance of cooperation with Dutch authorities. General Gustav Willem van Imhoff, commanding the beleaguered Dutch forces, recognized that corporate military resources were entirely inadequate for suppressing such pervasive popular resistance. Our military forces can control specific locations, but cannot prevent ongoing resistance throughout territories where local populations support anti-Dutch activities. Corporate resources are insufficient for maintaining permanent military occupation capable of eliminating organized resistance. The resistance succeeded because it imposed costs on corporate operations that dramatically exceeded the profits those operations generated. Defending corporate. The persistent need for permanent military garrisons drained the VOC's resources, consuming vast sums without generating corresponding revenue streams. Furthermore, the reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure demanded substantial capital investments, inevitably cutting into shareholder dividend payments. Crucially, relentless local resistance deterred the investments necessary for the territorial expansion that had historically fueled the company's growth. Shareholders soon began to ask difficult questions. Did imperial control truly yield returns sufficient to offset the immense military costs required to maintain that dominion? Between 1740 and 1750, VOC stock plummeted by 40%, a stark reflection of investor sentiment that the corporate empire had morphed from a profitable asset into a crippling financial liability. This financial distress was exacerbated by seismic shifts in global commerce that eroded the profitability inherent in the VOC's monopolistic control over Asian goods. Rival European merchants successfully cultivated alternative supply chains for the very spices and textiles that had once secured the company's extraordinary earnings. For example, English merchants established formidable spice plantations in their Caribbean colonies, producing cinnamon and nutmeg, comparable in quality to Indonesian harvests. French traders forged direct relationships with Indian textile manufacturers, completely circumventing Dutch commercial networks. Meanwhile, Spanish merchants expanded their Pacific reach, initiating direct trade between Asian producers and the lucrative American markets. These new sources destroyed the artificial scarcity that the VOC had relied upon for price manipulation, generating intense competitive pressure that slashed profit margins across the entire Asian trade sector. With customers now having access to equivalent products from numerous vendors, the VOC's capacity for monopoly pricing vanished. Furthermore, technological progress within European industry dramatically reduced the demand for many Asian commodities that had been the foundation of VOC wealth. European chemists invented synthetic dyes, displacing the need for traditional Asian textile colorings. Cheaper sugar flooded the market from European-run Caribbean plantations, undercutting Asian suppliers. Advances in European textile manufacturing diminished the appetite for imported Asian silk and cotton. Perhaps most significantly, European consumers began favoring new commodities: coffee, tea, chocolate, and tobacco, which the VOC failed to control because their production centers lay outside the company's Asian imperial domain. As global commerce migrated toward goods and regions the company could not dominate, the VOC's vast territorial control became increasingly economically obsolete. The logistical nightmare of governing immense territories with a small contingent of Dutch staff generated persistent administrative costs that devoured corporate resources without delivering commensurate revenues. The VOC maintained over 12,000 European administrators throughout Asia, backed by a military establishment of more than 20,000 soldiers dedicated to internal security. By 1750, these combined administrative and military burdens accounted for over 60% of corporate revenues, drastically reducing residual profits. This left the company unable to sustain dividend payments at levels robust enough to encourage continued investment. Consequently, numerous shareholders began divesting their VOC holdings, seeking more profitable ventures that did not necessitate the burdens of imperial governance. Furthermore, systemic corruption among corporate officers introduced crippling financial leakage, diminishing the profits available for distribution. Regional administrators across the empire routinely engaged in unauthorized private trading that directly competed with official VOC commerce, all while utilizing company assets and personnel for their personal gain. Governor-General Jacob Mossel articulated the severity of the crisis in a report to the Amsterdam directors. Company officials throughout our territories engage in systematic private trading that reduces corporate revenues while increasing administrative expenses. Personal corruption has become so widespread that official corporate activities generate insufficient profits to cover operational costs. This corruption was not a series of isolated incidents. It was systematic. Officials recognized the imminent decline of the VOC empire and sought to secure personal wealth before the inevitable corporate collapse foreclosed their opportunities for enrichment. Their calculus was simple. Personal survival demanded exploiting their corporate posts for individual benefit, rather than upholding shareholder interests that were quickly becoming precarious. Meanwhile, political dynamics in Europe began withdrawing crucial governmental support for the company's imperial authority. The Dutch Republic faced escalating military challenges from more powerful European nations that disputed Dutch territorial claims in Asia and contested their commercial privileges closer to home. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, 1784, brutally exposed how European conflicts could jeopardize corporate activities reliant on Dutch state protection. English naval forces seized numerous VOC installations throughout Asia and effectively severed the vital shipping lanes linking the corporate empire. The resultant war damages exceeding 43 million guilders, more than the VOC's entire annual revenue, demonstrated the profound vulnerability of corporate territorial control to European military struggles that the company itself lacked the power to influence or manage. The corporate empire demanded military backing that the struggling Dutch Republic could no longer reliably furnish. Financial ruin became irreversible when corporate debt decisively outstripped assets and investor confidence evaporated entirely. The company carried over 85 million guilders in debt against assets valued at roughly 60 million guilders. To continue operating, massive capital injections were required, but shareholders refused to provide them. The Dutch government attempted an elaborate rescue, offering financial subsidies and administrative reforms designed to transition the VOC from a private enterprise into a state-run colonial administration. However, these rescue efforts demanded resources the Republic could ill afford and, crucially, would have eradicated the corporate autonomy that had enabled its ruthless system of profit extraction. On the 31st of December 1799, the VOC officially ceased operations, transferring all territorial sovereignty, military assets, and administrative duties to the Dutch government. the world's pioneering multinational corporation, had collapsed after 197 years, a history that generated staggering wealth for European investors, but brought devastation to Asian populations across 3 continents. This collapse was not triggered by external conquest or sudden economic calamity. Rather, it sprang from the inherent contradictions of corporate imperialism. It required immense governmental resources to maintain territorial control, while simultaneously channeling profits exclusively toward private rather than public interests. The VOC learned that establishing a corporate empire was far simpler than sustaining it indefinitely against subject populations who fully grasped that the company's success depended on their permanent subjugation. While the VOC's financial innovations, administrative models, and military strategies would profoundly influence European colonialism for centuries, the core lesson remained indisputable. Private corporations might seize temporary imperial control, but upholding that dominion demanded state resources that inherently surpassed corporate financial capacity. The era of corporate empire was over, yet the structural precedents it established would define colonial relationships until colonialism itself became politically untenable in the 20th century. Although the VOC's corporate empire dissolved in 1799, its core business methodologies, legal architecture, and systematic pursuit of profit maximization continue to mold the landscape of contemporary capitalism in ways few people acknowledge. Observe the financial centers of any major metropolis today: New York, London, Tokyo, Singapore, and you are witnessing the direct lineage of systems the VOC pioneered. Mechanisms designed to siphon wealth from distant lands, while simultaneously furnishing legal immunity for systematic exploitation cloaked as legitimate enterprise. Today's multinational corporations utilize organizational blueprints, accounting standards, and legal frameworks that are direct descendants of the innovations developed by the VOC to manage institutional colonial violence while diligently ensuring shareholder returns. These include limited liability, which shields corporate investors from personal accountability for corporate offenses; transfer pricing, which allows for profit optimization through complex internal transactions between corporate divisions; and regulatory arbitrage, the calculated exploitation of differing national legal systems. Every one of these prevailing business strategies originated as VOC techniques, engineered to maximize colonial profit extraction, while simultaneously insulating the company from accountability for systematic brutality inflicted upon colonized populations. Consider Shell Oil, one of the globe's most dominant corporations, which inherited VOC methodologies through an institutional continuity spanning over 4 centuries. Royal Dutch Shell was born from the amalgamation of Dutch and British oil interests that operated within former VOC territories, utilizing commercial infrastructure, governmental ties, and extraction techniques originally perfected for the spice trade. Shell's activities in places like Nigeria, Indonesia, and other developing nations mirror VOC tactics: systematic environmental degradation, political compromise, and collaboration with military forces to control local populations while siphoning natural resources for European stakeholders. The company's sophisticated corporate architecture provides legal shields that fully insulate shareholders from accountability for environmental damage or human rights abuses. When Nigerian communities protested Shell's environmental devastation in the 1992, the company partnered with military forces who executed protest leaders, a suppression tactic chillingly reminiscent of the VOC's methods for crushing 17th-century resistance in Indonesia. Shell shareholders, meanwhile, celebrated soaring profits from Nigerian oil while maintaining a strict legal and moral detachment from the systematic violence required to secure those earnings. Similarly, the modern banking system utilizes financial engineering, originally conceived to manage VOC profits, and offer investment avenues for European shareholders who preferred to ignore the systematic violence underlying their returns. Institutions like the ABN AMRO Group and other prominent European banks trace their institutional heritage directly back to the financial houses that managed VOC wealth and financed its military campaigns across Asia. These banks persist in providing essential financial services for corporations engaged in pervasive environmental destruction and labor exploitation in the developing world, even as they market socially responsible investment products that help contemporary shareholders maintain a psychological buffer from ongoing corporate malfeasance. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the original venue for VOC share trading, set the precedent for financial market operations that currently allow investors to profit handsomely from systematic exploitation while remaining legally shielded from personal culpability. Today's stock markets rely on complex financial instruments specifically designed to sever the visible link between investment yields and the systematic violence necessary to produce those returns. Modern shareholders can invest in arms manufacturers that produce weapons for mass civilian casualties, agricultural enterprises relying on bonded labor, and extractive industries devastating indigenous lands, all while retaining legal immunity and comfortable psychological distance from the profound human cost of their decisions. The corporate legal architecture that shields multinational firms from accountability for systemic wrongdoing is founded upon principles initially crafted to facilitate VOC profit extraction from colonial holdings, while preempting effective legal challenges from victimized groups. Corporate personhood, the legal fiction granting corporations constitutional rights as individuals, emerged from precedents established when European governments formally acknowledged the VOC's sovereign authority over its Asian domains. Today, corporations cite constitutional protections to resist governmental oversight, while simultaneously claiming immunity from criminal prosecution for large-scale environmental sabotage, labor abuse, and political corruption. Moreover, the international trade system, which empowers modern corporations to capitalize on global regulatory disparities, utilizes frameworks designed initially to allow the VOC to bypass governmental scrutiny via strategic jurisdiction shopping. Contemporary corporations habitually establish subsidiaries in nations offering minimal environmental safeguards, weak labor protections, and limited legal oversight, a precise parallel to the VOC's practice of establishing operations where European legal systems were ineffective at regulating corporate conduct or protecting local populations from systematic abuse. International bodies like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, which enforce policies favoring corporations against resistant national governments, wield systematic economic leverage, comparable to VOC methods, for coercing local rulers into accepting commercial terms that benefited foreign shareholders rather than the welfare of the local population. When developing nations attempt to regulate multinational corporations engaged in systemic environmental damage or labor exploitation, these global institutions impose sanctions, forcing policy reversals favorable to corporate interests under the guise of legitimate international cooperation. Even the psychological mechanisms that permit modern consumers to enjoy low prices while disregarding the systematic exploitation required to achieve them operate via techniques first developed to enable VOC shareholders to revel in exceptional dividends while remaining emotionally detached from colonial violence. Today, consumers regularly purchase goods made by enslaved labor, agricultural products resulting from devastating environmental practices, and resources extracted through military collaboration, all while maintaining the psychological reassurance that their consumption habits constitute legitimate market participation rather than complicity in ongoing corporate atrocities. The intentional complexity of modern supply chains, which deliberately obscures the link between finished products and the systematic violence required for raw material extraction, utilizes techniques originally perfected so that VOC customers could buy Asian commodities without confronting the genocide, enslavement, and ecological devastation necessary for production. Educational institutions teaching business ethics, global development, and economic history routinely minimize or completely omit the history of systematic violence that generated contemporary corporate fortunes. Instead, they champion entrepreneurship, innovation, and free market competition as morally neutral or inherently beneficial forces. Business schools across North America and Europe use VOC operations as case studies, but their focus remains strictly on organizational efficiency, strategic planning, and financial invention, never on the systemic violence against indigenous peoples or the enduring human consequences of amassed corporate wealth. This pedagogy effectively conditions students psychologically to accept modern corporate crimes as unfortunate but inevitable business realities, while simultaneously providing the professional skills necessary to participate in systematic exploitation disguised as career advancement. Perhaps the most troubling legacy is the continued corporate exploitation of indigenous populations. These groups still face relentless, systematic violence for refusing to relinquish their ancestral territories to multinational corporations intent on extracting resources for faraway shareholders. Mining enterprises in the Amazon, vast palm oil plantations in Indonesia, and natural gas projects across Africa all deploy systematic violence against indigenous communities, employing tactics directly comparable to the VOC's colonial methods of crushing resistance. Indigenous communities defending their traditional homelands against corporate destruction confront military forces, often funded, equipped, and trained by the very multinational corporations that collaborate with national governments to eliminate resistance through acts of systematic terrorism akin to VOC operations in 17th-century Asia. Contemporary shareholders of these extractive industries celebrate record profits while maintaining both legal protection and psychological insulation from the genocidal violence essential to securing corporate access to indigenous lands and resources. The intellectual scaffolding used by corporate executives, government officials, and academic experts to justify today's systematic exploitation relies on the very moral arguments first created to rationalize VOC colonial brutality. Modern justifications for corporate excess stress, economic development, technological advancement, and market efficiency precisely mirroring how VOC officials invoked civilizing missions, commercial freedom, and beneficial cultural exchange to excuse widespread genocide and environmental ruin. The moral detachment that allows highly educated professionals to participate in systematic exploitation while still viewing themselves as ethical individuals functions through psychological mechanisms perfected long ago, enabling VOC shareholders and administrators to celebrate colonial riches while consciously ignoring the colonial violence that produced them. The VOC established indelible precedents for global capitalism. Systematic violence could indeed yield immense profits, provided corporate leaders possessed the finesse to manipulate legal frameworks, financial instruments, and moral narratives skillfully enough to cloak atrocities as legitimate business. Modern capitalism inherited these foundational precedents, including the institutional structures, financial innovations, and cultural assumptions that permit contemporary corporations to achieve systematic exploitation while retaining legal immunity and popular acceptance. Comprehending VOC precedents is therefore crucial, not only for diagnosing the mechanics of contemporary corporate crimes, but also for understanding why our legal, political, and educational systems consistently fail to impose meaningful accountability for systematic corporate violence against vulnerable communities. This legacy is far more than a historical footnote. It is the structural bedrock upon which everything else is constructed. The VOC's two-century dominance as the planet's most powerful commercial entity offers critical insights into how entrenched corporate power can systematically erode governmental sovereignty, dismantle democratic frameworks, and foster economic models that place shareholder returns above the imperative of human survival. Today's policymakers, business leaders, and citizens disregard these historical warnings at immense risk. For contemporary multinational corporations, command capabilities far surpassing those available to the VOC, operating within global structures that offer even less effective oversight or accountability for corporate offenses. The first essential lesson pertains to the dynamic between corporate might and democratic governance. The VOC proved that a private corporation, endowed with adequate economic strength, can accumulate sovereign authority, thereby freeing itself from state regulation and enabling it to skew governmental policies to serve corporate interests rather than the public good. Modern multinational corporations exert political leverage that often overshadows that of entire national governments, achieved through massive campaign funding, lobbying efforts, and systemic regulatory capture that consistently shifts policy in favor of corporate agendas, irrespective of electoral results or popular mandates. Amazon's capacity to secure billions in tax concessions while paying minimal corporate taxes illustrates how contemporary firms can manipulate public policy to benefit shareholders while evading essential civic obligations toward public services or infrastructure development. Facebook's unchecked operation, despite routine violations of privacy rights, interference in democratic processes, and facilitation of genocidal rhetoric, demonstrates how modern corporations achieve virtual immunity from meaningful governmental scrutiny. Similarly, the pharmaceutical industry's sustained ability to uphold patent monopolies generates exceptional profits, but blocks public access to vital medications, revealing how contemporary corporations exploit legal structures to engineer artificial scarcity that serves shareholder wealth while inflicting systemic human suffering. The second lesson speaks to the corporate use of systematic violence to achieve strategic objectives. The VOC established that private entities could deploy military force more ruthlessly and efficiently than traditional governments, provided executives were prepared to employ unbounded brutality against civilian populations obstructing profit maximization. Today, multinational corporations persist in deploying systematic violence against resistant communities, yet they maintain legal immunity through intricate corporate structures that ensure plausible deniability for their offenses. Mining firms routinely hire private military contractors to neutralize indigenous opposition to resource extraction. Agricultural giants collaborate with paramilitary groups to crush labor organization among plantation workers. Technology companies supply sophisticated surveillance equipment and data analysis that facilitates governmental repression against political dissidents. These corporate crimes attract minimal media attention and face virtually no legal sanction because modern legal systems uphold the principle of limited liability, a doctrine initially devised to shield VOC shareholders from culpability for colonial atrocities. The third lesson highlights the corporate capacity for manipulating financial markets to extract wealth from productive economies without contributing actual economic development. The VOC perfected techniques involving market cornering, monopoly domination, and systematic corruption to secure staggering profits that yielded no commensurate benefit to local populations or global economic growth. Contemporary financial institutions now engage in high-frequency trading, speculative derivatives, and systemic market manipulation, effectively siphoning wealth from genuine economic activity, while simultaneously engineering financial instability that cripples national economies and impoverishes working citizens. The 2008 financial collapse serves as a brutal demonstration of how contemporary corporations deploy complex financial instruments to generate astronomical profits for executives and shareholders while inflicting catastrophic losses on ordinary citizens who, despite having no role in the corporate decisions, bore the full weight of the corporate crimes. Wall Street banks earned billions from mortgage-backed securities they knew were toxic, while everyday homeowners lost their life savings and faced foreclosure due to financial fraud they neither understood nor could prevent. The fourth lesson addresses corporate dominance over information systems used to sway public opinion and circumvent meaningful democratic oversight. The VOC recognized that information control was paramount for maintaining popular consent for systemic exploitation and stifling effective political opposition. Today's technology giants command the distribution of information via social media platforms, search engines, and massive data collection systems, enabling the systematic manipulation of public perception alongside unprecedented surveillance capabilities that fundamentally threaten democratic institutions. Google's ability to skew search results to favor its corporate agenda while burying information about its own misdeeds. Facebook's capacity to disseminate political misinformation that influences election results while harvesting personal data for unprecedented private surveillance. Amazon's practice of monitoring consumer behavior and using that intelligence to eliminate competitors. These information control capabilities grant contemporary corporations a power over democratic processes that far exceeds the reach of historical authoritarian regimes, largely because corporate information control operates through market mechanisms that preserve the illusion of consumer choice while removing meaningful alternatives. The fifth lesson involves the psychological structures that permit educated populations to endorse systematic exploitation, while maintaining a self-perception of morality. The VOC succeeded because Dutch society could celebrate exceptional investment returns while remaining utterly separated, psychologically, from the systemic violence required to generate those returns. Modern societies utilize similar psychological shielding to support corporate crimes, while simultaneously affirming beliefs in democracy, human rights, and ethical business practices. American consumers, for instance, can rejoice over low prices for consumer goods while comfortably ignoring the labor abuse, environmental devastation, and political corruption necessary to deliver those bargains. European investors fund socially responsible portfolios, yet accept returns derived from systematic corporate crimes committed in developing nations. Academic institutions teach business ethics, while their training programs equip professionals to participate actively in systematic exploitation. The sixth lesson addresses the international institutional scaffolding that facilitates corporate exploitation while presenting a facade of legitimate global cooperation. The VOC leveraged treaty systems that recognized its sovereign corporate authority, thereby obstructing genuine legal accountability for crimes against local populations. Contemporary international bodies fulfill a similar role. They enforce corporate-friendly mandates against resisting national governments, all while preserving the appearance of legitimate international law and beneficial economic development. The World Trade Organization systematically blocks national governments from regulating multinational corporations involved in environmental damage, labor exploitation, or institutional corruption. The International Monetary Fund dictates economic policies that actively expedite corporate resource extraction while preventing national governments from protecting their citizens against corporate abuses. These international institutions establish legal conditions for systematic corporate exploitation, guaranteeing corporate interests over public welfare, irrespective of the democratic outcomes within sovereign nations. The paramount lesson, however, concerns the urgent need for systematic institutional reform designed to subordinate corporate power to democratic authority, moving beyond reliance on voluntary corporate responsibility or self-correcting market mechanisms to prevent crimes. The VOC's systemic crimes were not products of insufficient regulation or imperfect competition. They arose from institutional frameworks that prioritized maximizing private profit over public well-being, while granting legal immunity for systemic corporate violence against vulnerable peoples. Contemporary corporate crimes utilize identical institutional structures, enabling systematic exploitation, while offering legal protection and political shelter for the executives and shareholders who profit from systematic human misery. Effective solutions necessitate fundamental structural changes to corporate legal charters, financial regulations, and international bodies changes that would abolish limited liability for systematic corporate crimes, neutralize corporate political influence that destabilizes democracy, and subject corporate profit goals to democratic oversight and human welfare considerations. These institutional overhauls face monumental political opposition, given that contemporary corporate power often exceeds that of most national governments and operates within global systems that impede meaningful democratic or legal accountability. Yet, the eventual collapse of the VOC proves that even the most formidable corporate behemoths cannot indefinitely sustain exploitation against populations who grasp that the company's success demands their permanent subordination. Understanding the VOC's precedents offers crucial perspective for identifying how contemporary corporate power endangers democratic systems and human welfare, providing essential guidance for developing institutional reforms capable of subjugating corporate power to the needs of democracy and survival. These are not merely historical insights. They are survival instructions for societies striving to uphold democratic governance and human welfare in an age of unprecedented corporate domination. When we examine the full trajectory of the VOC's corporate empire, we are studying the foundational blueprint for modern capitalism, a system engineered to generate extraordinary wealth for private investors via the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations, all while securing legal protection against accountability for the human consequences. The sheer magnitude of the VOC's achievements remains astonishing. A single private corporation controlled a territory larger than Europe, governed over 4 million people, and amassed profits equivalent to $7.9 trillion in modern currency. They proved that private organizations could achieve imperial authority with greater efficiency than traditional governments, provided they were willing to wield unlimited violence in pursuit of limitless profit. But the most insidious facet of the VOC's history is not merely the systematic brutality it enacted, but the masterful way it engineered institutional frameworks that successfully disguised mass violence as legitimate commercial enterprise, a blueprint that continues to shield corporate wrongdoing in the present day. Indeed, the structural pillars of contemporary capitalism owe their existence directly to the innovations the VOC pioneered solely to maximize colonial profit extraction. We see this legacy in limited liability, which effectively immunizes shareholders from responsibility for corporate crimes; transfer pricing, a mechanism enabling sophisticated tax avoidance via complex internal corporate transactions; regulatory arbitrage, permitting corporations to shrewdly exploit gaps and differences between disparate national legal systems; and market manipulation, used to create artificial scarcity and inflate prices, ensuring maximum returns at the expense of human need. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed VOC shareholders to revel in extraordinary dividends while deliberately ignoring systematic genocide are fully operational today. Modern investors routinely profit from corporate crimes, from labor abuses to environmental destruction, all while maintaining a comfortable cognitive dissonance, firmly believing in their own adherence to ethical business practices and democratic values. Furthermore, modern consumers engage daily with products manufactured by exploited or enslaved labor, agricultural goods resulting from severe environmental destruction, and natural resources violently extracted through military collaboration. Yet, they retain the psychological comfort that their market participation constitutes legitimate commerce, successfully dissociating themselves from any complicity in these ongoing corporate crimes. This dangerous cycle is reinforced by educational systems. Business history curriculums consistently celebrate VOC innovation, organizational efficiency, and financial success, effectively minimizing or entirely overlooking the catastrophic systematic violence against indigenous populations that actually generated this massive corporate wealth. Consequently, business schools throughout Europe and North America utilize VOC operations as premier case studies for successful strategic planning, a framework divorced entirely from any meaningful discussion of the genocide, mass slavery, and widespread environmental destruction inherent in their model. This deeply flawed educational approach cultivates the psychological acceptance of contemporary corporate crimes as mere, unavoidable business realities. Simultaneously, it provides professional training that actively enables participation in systematic exploitation conveniently packaged as legitimate career development. Ultimately, the powerful legal frameworks that granted the VOC sweeping territorial control, while simultaneously barring any accountability for their atrocities, established enduring and dangerous precedents.